Beau,
Sam,
what's happening?
how are you doing?
I'm good. I I also shared this link with my partner and co-designer of the book, Trung, so you may see him in the waiting room.
Oh, okay. Oh, great.
Um, but I'm a writer. He's the reason it's beautiful.
You mean the beauty has nothing to do with the writing?
I mean, hopefully a little bit, but let's be honest, bright colors and beautiful pictures and cool symbols, like that's cool.
It is. It really is. It is
Yeah.
beautiful. There he is. Um, Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
Uh, so Sam was just saying you've made the book beautiful. I have a feeling that there is a mutuality in that, though.
That's right.
So, thank you for joining on. It's an added bonus. So we were just talking about the school. I'll come back to that because I think it'd be interesting. It's called Learning Project. But so Lee, now that you've joined, it would be wonderful to find out. So I'm Beau, right? So I run the Lab of Misfits, so to speak, and
I love that title, by the way, the Lab of Misfits.
well, it's just a literal statement, right? It's nothing but just a literal description of what it is. It's a lab, and it's full of misfits. But for me, what misfits are, I think everyone's a misfit. I mean, that's why my book's called Deviate, because to deviate is just to be yourself. I think ultimately, it's about that. And misfits, it's not that they don't fit anywhere; it's they fit in lots of places, right? And so in a sense, they can have a sense of homelessness because they can sort of be at home in many places. So I assume that you two are fairly misfitty.
Yep.
Yeah, in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe Sam, we'll start with you. But so I'm asking a really silly, in some sense, I actually find it a really interesting question, depending on, according to how people answer. But so who are you? Are you going to reduce that to 6 words or 3 words or? And again, answer as you will.
Yeah. So my 3-word answer is on the path.
Okay.
I'm 50. I'm the father of 2. I'm a perpetual wanderer. I'm deeply peripatetic. I'm very much a work in process. I feel like the thing that I'm most curious about are the biggest questions that relate to who we are and why we're here. And one of the things that's been fun about my partnership with Lee is being able to channel that kind of like howling at the moon impracticality into the stuff that we actually get to do, like for a living. Which I'm sure all of us that are in that situation never really thought it was possible. And yet here we are, look at us.
Well, what do you mean by that, actually? I mean, I have a sense, but what do you mean? Look at us what?
Look at us doing that thing that we're most passionate about and being able to do it and feel constantly fueled by and driven by and inspired by it. Aren't we lucky? And also, I guess, why can't everybody do that? Like, what needs to happen in order for more people to feel like they're able to do the thing that they feel most called to do in the world?
Do you feel that people have a sense of what that is for themselves?
I mean,
in general. I mean, it's a general.
Yeah. No is the short answer, which is the first problem, the root of the problem. And then the second problem is for many that maybe do feel they can at least articulate the rough edges of it. It's having the combination of courage and luck and pluck to just give it a go.
Yeah, I like to come back to that, because I think the giving it a go is and courage. I think it's such an important one, as opposed to confidence. Right. So Lee, same question. Oh, well, so you're silent.
Yeah. So I'll start with the easy stuff. I'm also dad, husband, father of 4 children.
Thanks for specifying, because I wasn't sure.
Yeah. And you know, as you know, like, America has gone through pretty serious stuff in the last 4 years, which connected me back to, like, that sense of figuring out who you are, your identity as a first generation American. And so it further amplified, like Sam talks about wandering, like I'm in search of a greater sense of belonging. Because, like, you live the life of you live through this experience of being an immigrant and the refugees. There's that sense of being displaced is always going to stay with you. And so within the last 5 years, I had a chance to go back to Vietnam after leaving there when I was 11. After 40 something years, I had the chance to go back to Vietnam. And so, like, and the intersections of what American, culture, language, society, politics have been going through and still going through it in the last 4 years, it further amplified the idea that you are different in the American context. And you've spent your entire life wanting to blend in, wanting to be invisible, and still somehow being identified to be different as not a true American, right? So all that, I'm at that stage now where you do a lot of reflections upon your own personal path, and so I think that greatest sense of belonging it's been occupying my mind. Right, and that's in even the larger context of, like, do I belong in America? Right, and that's some of the things that the politics and the conversation in politics has been asking a lot of us who are first generations here, and even many generations, but not white. Right, so. Yeah, it's front and center to what we're going through right now, and certainly from a personal perspective for me.
And what's your answer?
My answer was reinforced by that young poet, right, at the inauguration. The country's not broken, it's just not finished. And the idea of trying to find light in infinite of shades is a lifetime worth of work and search. So yeah, damn it, I'm an American, and I'm going to fight for it.
Why do you think? Because I want to come, of course, to the work, but I feel the work is related to this, of course, which is, why does it matter to belong to America or in general, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I can give you an evolutionary reason,
why,
but I'm wondering from, who cares?
Yeah, I guess that might be a perspective of
I don't mean to America, I mean in general, as a person.
I think that might be a perspective of not feeling displaced or different, maybe, right? Because if you live the my experience is like you're always feel that you're not the same as everyone else around you. And you know, I still remember like trying really hard to lose any sense of an accent, right? When I was younger and just trying to adapt to a completely different culture. Worked very hard at that. So I'm yeah, I think that there might be an attitude of, you know, why does it matter? And I think that question is now more front and center for me than when I was a younger person going through it. You know, there might be a point where you just say, you know, I don't care what people think. But looking back, there obviously there was a point where I for most of us, we did care what people think about us and how we are different, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so during evolution, of course, to not be part of a group was death, right? To be independent, so to speak, was not an option. If you weren't social, you died. And even wild dogs, for instance, if one of them misbehaves, they don't kill it, they just excommunicate it, right? So to be alone in nature is to not die. I'm sorry, is to die. So we have such a strong need to belong, because if we're not, it literally triggers within us that fear and that uncertainty and insecurity of literal survival. Yeah. And so I wonder what the nature of belonging, and so to not belong is actually, in some sense, a more conscious choice than it is to belong. So I wonder whether belonging is maybe more about having a sense of existence, that you exist in the world, as opposed to, I'm wondering for phrasing belongingness as I matter, as opposed to I belong. So I think, for instance, the distinction between loneliness and aloneness, there's tremendous loneliness now and for a long time, right? But especially now, and you get in urban environments especially. And I'm seeing that maybe the distinction between aloneness versus loneliness is to be alone without a choice, whereas aloneness is to choose to be alone, right? And so that's one aspect, but the other is, I think we all, in all our brains, have that sense of needing to exist in relationship too, because that's the only way we have a sense of existence, right? And that you have an effect on the world. And if you don't feel like you exist, then you have a ghost. And I feel like that's a lot of what was happening politically on all sides, and Black Lives Matter, the march, etc. It was basically people who felt like they didn't exist, right? That they had no impact and had no effect. And we work with kids from very difficult backgrounds, and the sense is that they don't matter. So what they do is they burn a car. And in Scotland, for instance, they live in Scotland, they burn the car and they say, look, now I matter. Look, I'm having an effect. I now exist. It's either that or suicide. Right, so I'm wondering to what extent belongingness is about value, as opposed to being, do you see what I mean? Or do you think it's different? For either?
That's really interesting. I don't think for me it's about whether I matter, because I do know that I do matter in various layers of existence, right? I certainly matter to my own families. I know that, right? There's a great sense of connections and love there. I know I matter to Sam as we're building this friendship and working relationship with each other. So it's not so much about whether I matter or not. I think that it might be it might be really just amplified by what we're going through right now as a country, where there is a greater sense of discussion about equity and racial justice and, original stories about our own country, good and bad. Like, we all have to admit to that. And so the greater sense of belonging, maybe it's more meta than anything else. Like, I just recently picked up a really thick book to learn more about the Vietnam War. I mean, what led to it, right? And interestingly enough, it was actually written by a British historian. And I did that on purpose because there's I sense a sense of neutrality there. It's not from just strictly the American perspective.
Yeah.
It's not strictly from the French perspective, and it's not strictly from a Vietnamese perspective. It's somebody that is able to spend, years kind of researching and looking deeper into the intersection of all the cultures that took place that resulted in, a horrific war that lasted for 30 years. And for me, there was another way of just trying to identify, like, where do I belong? And I don't have that figured out. And to a certain extent, in responding to, like, in thinking about what Sam was saying, that, he's on a wandering path. I'm kind of going through a sense of, like, searching deeper for that meaning of belonging.
Yes.
The only thing I would add is, we were talking about a little bit ago, the equally felt human needs to long and belong, and the idea that, which is a new idea for me, only minutes old, right? That the way to better understand that is that longing is what sets us in motion, and belonging is what keeps our feet on the ground. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes sense for us as Homo sapiens. And then each of us as Homo sapiens inhabiting our particular bodies and our particular social contexts encounter different levels of obstacles to experiencing both of those. So, like, I really hear, I'm not a first generation American. I don't have the immigrant and the refugee story. And I therefore have a different relationship in my social context to longing and belonging. And hearing Lee's version of, the recent menace that was directly challenging his right to belong, is something that I have yet to directly experience. I merely feel the awareness of it and the responsibility to do something about it. But so it makes me think the ways in which our social contexts make it easier or harder to experience both sides of that fundamental human duality.
Yeah. When I was writing about this topic in relation to the marches, a number of people would say, you know what, I can't empathize because I haven't had that lived experience. And my suggestion was, you don't have to empathize at that level, right? How could you, in some sense? Now, you could through imagination, and that's why we have imagination in one sense, but how could you truly feel it And I said, well, there's a way of empathizing where you empathize at a different level, which is all shared, which you've all had the sense of feeling alone. You've had the sense of not being heard. You've had the sense of not existing. Now, I don't want to confuse the subjective with the objective. It could be your partner. We've all, your parents growing up. And I said, you have that sense of loneliness or that comes from that. So you can empathize at that level. And that can give you a way into then the story that led to it. So you can have a sense, you can empathize with that sense of rejection, though the source of the rejection is completely different, right? But the feeling that it creates is because it's constructed the brain. It's a shared feeling, but the objective source can be very, very different, and the objective source can be far more severe in one case than the other. So I said, don't confuse the subjective with the objective. Some people do have a far more objectively very difficult path to get there than others. But how do you get there? And I think that's the human way to get there. Because I think everyone has that sense of, again, for very different reasons. And I feel that in some sense that can be mechanisms by which to bring people together, the integration, because that, I think America, for instance, is massively diverse, but it's not a melting pot in my experience. I was there for only 25 years. I've been in Europe for the rest of my time, which is about 27, 28 years. But it feels like there's tremendous diversity, but not much integration. And it's that integration that actually is creates a more resilient, adaptable system, as you, in some sense, write about.
Yeah, that is, at least here in America, that is the ongoing aspiration. I mean, like in some respects, we are a remarkable country in the sense that we really were the world's first new nation, in the idea of like your standing in the social order is based on a fundamental allegiance to principles and ideals, not kinship and connection. Mm-hmm. That's always been an idea, not a reality. What's fascinating for me as an American and as somebody that I taught English and history, and I got a master's in American studies, like I've never been able to choose between those two things, is the ways in which we play out this core tension between who we aspire to be and who we actually are. Mm-hmm. And allowing the beauty of the aspiration remain what we look on, and allowing ourselves to acknowledge truthfully who and where we are. Mm-hmm. And that's, I mean, one of the things that one of the artists whose work we highlight and elevate in Seed and Spark is James Baldwin. And of course, there's lots of people that have done it, but just one voice of somebody who was talking 50 years ago about the extent to which white identity and black identity are wound up in a deeply dysfunctional dance. And until we are able to choreograph a different set of steps together, we will remain stuck in that dance, which has great consequences for all of us. Mm-hmm.
So in that context, can you talk about your work, that the creation the co-creation that you two made?
Yeah, you want to go first or secondly?
I'll take a stab at it. I think that that's actually the wandering part for me, right? Is when I feel grateful that I worked on 2 book projects, one with Sam and the other one with Bruce Mao.
I know Bruce.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. Well, boy, talk about, like, he was one of those things that really kind of shake your head a little bit. and always kind of push you in a very helpful way to ask bigger questions. So for me, it's always been like, if you're on this kind of from the work perspective and trying to find meaningful work to dive into, starting out with some bigger central questions is always important, right? It's always critical. And so I think Seed and Spark started as one of those intentionally designed wandering path, right? And we didn't know what we were going to come out of it, but we knew that it's worth asking the questions. What are some essential, irreducible aspects of a healthy living and learning communities? And so if we're able to get a sense of that, to have some sense of clarity, that it will obviously improve the work that we're doing with our own communities. And even before that, we didn't realize that we were getting to a point, based upon the series of conversations we had with co-collaborators, that we would end up with, again, kind of forgotten about the idea of how nature evolved, and it's always been there to guide us and to gives us clues in terms of how we should coexist within this interconnected one ecosystem that we call planet Earth, right? So so that's really kind of how, at least in my own head, I wanted to start this project.
Yeah, I just want to underscore two parts of that, which are, first, that Seed and Spark came into being because we set out in search of like the irreducible DNA of a really healthy learning environment. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, it seems so obvious to say now that we would end up in nature, but we didn't ask that question thinking or knowing that that's where we would end up. And of course, now that we've arrived there, and I really do say we've arrived there because for us, this still all feels very nascent. I know that there are other people and there are other networks that figured this out long ago, and I mean that actually both as long ago as any indigenous culture in the history of humanity, but also people that have been more attuned to some of the core elements of what we're highlighting for the last 50 years. So it's still new to us, but it's safe to say that it has completely and forever changed the way that we think about our work as designers. That there really is only one way forward, and that is for us to figure out how to kind of right-size our human footprint and live more ecologically, which means by definition that we recognize we are nature. It isn't that we have to protect nature. We were just in conversation with Jim Garrison of Ubiquity University, and I loved the way that he put it, where he said, we are nature speaking and listening to itself. Yes. And so Seed and Spark is, I suppose, our effort to build a breadcrumb trail for readers of all of the different kind of invisible threads hanging down from the cosmos that help alight us to the understanding that we are nature speaking and listening to itself, including Deviate and the Lab of Misfits, right? Like there are some of those threads and some of those voices like yours in the book that are primarily reflecting on those questions through the perspective of neuroscience, of the brain, of perception. And then there's people that are studying slime mold. And then there's James Baldwin writing about race. And then there's Liz Lerman setting choreography to the voices of molecular scientists. And all of it is tracing back, if we're willing to see it that way, to this irreducible DNA in which there is no separation.
And what do you think is, so I mean, we've for so many years seen ourselves outside, of course, when of course we are not only the products of, we're defined by. And for perception, for instance, you're actually looking through nature, right? You're not looking at it. You're actually looking through. And what's more, it's you're actually looking through millions of years of evolution, right? You're the manifestation of all that interaction. And I have a personal reason for why it's very important for people to have that awareness, and the potential consequences of that awareness, because I think it begins with awareness, because with awareness you have choice. Without awareness you don't have a choice. You're just constantly responding, and responding in ways that are unconscious, reflexive. So what for you is the significance of that awareness that you described, that you would hope for?
Lee, you or me?
I'll speak at that awareness. That's, I love now that you kind of frame that as looking through nature rather than looking at it. So if you just kind of take it down to the practice of architecture, right? We use human center all the time as language. We use sustainability all the time as a language. And I think that we need to get over that and move on to the idea of regenerative, because and I actually heard this from Bruce Mao. So I would like to know more in terms of how you connect with him. But at one point I invited Bruce to a workshop for a charter school in the Southwest side. We went through kind of this master planning. And at that point, it was a big deal to say, yeah, we're going to come out and we're going to declare that this campus will be net zero, right? That was the language of the day. And Bruce just kind of paused back and he said, net zero, all you need is to get one more electron and you can be net positive, right? And so I think that now we know that sustainability is not enough. It's regenerative, because sustainability is just getting us back to zero, right? It's not healing, and we're in the stage of healing. And same way with human center, I think that we're starting to use humanity center, because we have to make design decisions on the awareness that there is a greater impact upon the whole ecosystem beyond just the human conditions. And so, one of the things that I talk about, it really bugs me that at the end of the year, they always advertise about the next tallest building in the world.
Yeah.
And, they would show these elevations, these towers just keep getting higher and higher. I don't know for what purpose we'll keep doing this. But that's more human center, because it's probably more ego, and not humanity center, which is what are the resources that we're taking away in order to build these continuously higher and higher building. Certainly we master the physics and the engineering, that's not hard. Now we have to think differently. We have to be more aware of the stuff that we're building and creating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what I would add to that is, so through our partnership and Lee's training as an architect, I feel like I'm learning more what it means to be humanity-centered. And I'm not really trained as a storyteller and a filmmaker, I mean, I'm not really, I don't know what I'm trained for, but I really am like a writer and a film, I'm a storyteller. And so for me, I feel like my contribution to humanity-centered, and this is both selfless and selfish, is to try to set the conditions for epiphany. And to be clear, I mean that in trying to set conditions for other people to have an epiphany, and always trying to set the conditions for my own next epiphany. Like, it's not like I figured it out and I'm just trying to set everything up, but I do feel like we desperately need now. I mean, our lives are on the line. If we don't find a new story for humanity by which we can learn and live, then we will die. And of course, that's not gonna happen overnight. And of course, there are lots of positive examples all around us, the ways in which that new story, which is actually the oldest story of all, is already alive in the world, just as we see the ways in which it's not. So I would say that's really the main motivation.
Tell me about the sort of the imagery and etc. that you've used to create the book. Where did that come from?
Yeah, well, that's a huge influence from working with Bruce, right? I mean, imageries, visual composition, fonts, that's all language, different types of language. And you know, I think he has this saying that there's no more back of stage. Everything is visible, everything is transparent. So that was kind of the attitude that I was thinking about in terms of the visual of the book, and just find hopeful connections, you know, to what's out there. You know, we use Gotham Bowl as headline, as the font, because I remember seeing Obama posters and discover that you know, the designer also used Gotham Bowl. So these little kind of miniature stories emerge over time, but certainly has a way in which we wanted to design the visual paralleling the language that Sam was writing. And certainly, you know, the process has always been that I would read what Sam had written, and like imagery would emerge in my own head, right? So that was kind of the part of the thinking, and just kind of delaying designing of the visual until you actually feel and read the language. I think the other thing that we were trying to do is the power of an image should be more metaphorical rather than you know, practical or direct connections. So there's always kind of this idea of using imagery and composition and design to keep expanding the metaphorical power of whatever that story is starting to emerge, right? So, you know, I kept thinking at one point we were discussing the magicalness of octopus, right? So again, it was like, how do we bring that discovery? How do we bring that wonder into what we essentially had laid out? This is kind of the blueprint of nature itself, right? So again, that was also part of the design thinking behind the visual of the book.
And Sam, for the writing?
So I think, so first of all, as I know you know, as somebody that's written a book, when you write a book, first of all, you learn so much. So I felt like, you know, this has been a 18-month to 2-year process where being able to just go down the rabbit hole of slime mold and understand it, and or being able to think about what possible words can I offer that can contextualize the visual poetry of Andy Goldsworthy's sculpture. So it was a wonderful dance between, you know, I mean, words are simultaneously like our best friends and our biggest enemies, because they're all I have right now to convey what I'm thinking and feeling to you. And yet they're always still contained within their own basic prison of assumptions and past associations. So for this project in particular, what I was trying to do was offer just enough to kind of gently provide just enough frame for the reader to then go wherever they wanted. So for example, one of the things that I've heard from people, which I love, and we didn't say this explicitly, but we kind of hoped that people would pick it up implicitly, is you can read this book in whatever order you want. So like, as again, one of the design decisions that I love that Lee made was color coding the chapters. So there's a color for relationships, and there's even decisions that went into why yellow for relationships and why, but so there's both this subtle reminder of things that are held together in a certain way, along with the implicit permission to just ignore it all and read all of the art sections, or read page 20 and then read page 100, because it's a spiral. It's all connected, and there's a value to reading it linearly, just as there's a value to reading it in whatever order you want.
That's wonderful. That's such a complex task, right? And in order to do that, you would have had to discover what those principles are that hold it all together to make that happen. So what did you discover in that? What were the principles that, and I imagine that those are the principles, of course, when it comes to learning. And I'd love to, I could talk to you for a long time about the learning in the school, because we're developing a school, as we were talking about it before. But what are those principles that enable learning? Right, that enable discovery? Because you're creating a space for people to discover. And it's not an instruction manual. Instruction manuals are just really bad poetry, right? Because it doesn't let the reader add anything of themselves. So you created a space for people to discover, and some of those things they'll discover will have maybe you won't know that they're going to discover, right? Especially if you start reading it in different directions, because now you're going to have a temporal context that's going to shape each page depending on the page you read just before, right? And what's more, the other thing I love about what you've done, both with the writing and the imagery, is you've created a sense of wonder, and in particular awe and wonder, right? And by finding the impossible within the common, which is what I like to describe what awe and wonder is about. We tend to think of it as a grand scale thing, but when we can find, when in the right hands, you can give people a sense of impossibility in what's around you, suddenly that opens up the mind to then make those discoveries. So inherent in what you've created is exactly those necessary elements to open the mind, and then to create that possibility of letting go in order to make new discoveries to expand. So what did you expand into that you feel are, I don't want to say directly applicable, but they might be?
I'll go first this time, Lee. So I feel like what was thrilling for me, because as I said, we didn't head out thinking that we would end up where we ended up. So it was thrilling for me to discover the tracks that had been laid down by people that preceded us about these central design principles of the natural world. People like Stephanie Pace Marshall and Fritjof Capra, and that the language they were using to describe living systems was the language that I, as an educator, felt I immediately understood. I mean, the idea, for example, that the three fundamental pillars that allow a living system to take root are identity, information, and relationships. I immediately, identity, information, and relationships.
Yeah.
And then our elaboration on that in the book is that then that means the questions are who and why we are, what and why we notice, and how and why we connect. Like that right there is the recipe for a healthy school. Like, help everybody develop a strong sense of individual and collective identity. That's more important than studying American history. I mean, if American history is a vehicle to that, great, but that's the thing. Ensuring that meaningful information can travel easily and transparently. And always focusing on increasing both the quantity and the quality of relationships between members of the community. You do those three things, you have the roots of a living system. And I mean, I could go on, but Lee, I want to, you pick it up from there and see where you want to take it.
So let me understand your question, Beau. Are you saying like what did we learn from this journey in doing this project in relative to learning itself, relative to the process of learning itself?
Yeah, for instance, your own learning process, but also the principles that would enable learning.
So my epiphany in a way was just to be reinforced by the richness that we have now understood, that we do not exist in a Newtonian world, right? That we've set up experiment to measure specifically what we want to measure, and once we do that, we discard the power of the relationship and the layering of the complexity of what learning is all about, right? And so certainly you can expand the metaphor of the quantum world, in which we set up an experiment to measure where the thing is, and we lose the sense of where it's going, right? On and on and on. So what I really appreciate, and this really is sort of Sam's idea from the very beginning, is once we have whatever it is, we need to somehow tell the story through various lenses, right? It started with an essential question, but can we tell the same story through art? Can we tell the same story through very specific aspects of science? Can we tell the same story through a personal experience of a community? And I think that the layering of it, if we put one in front of each other and look through it, that's when we see kind of the power of nature, right? Beyond measuring just the pure quantifiable linearness of nature. And then I think that does have a complete direct overlay to the system of learning that we've set up for ourselves, because it's really meant and designed to measure one very specific thing, right? And it's literally saying that we are learning and studying for the tests, and the whole system is that way. And because we do that, we discard, more than 50% of the humans who really don't want to learn that way, right? And they perceive as stupid or failing because the system is forced to measure a very specific thing, which is very counterintuitive to who they are. So that it's not an epiphany like, oh my God, but it's almost like a design process and a design journey that somewhat validate what we've been feeling for a very, very long time, in terms of, yes, we really need to create a new narrative, a new story, a new landscape for living and learning.
Yeah, well said. I completely agree. I mean, as you know, the education system is largely coming out of the Victorians, and we measure the things that we can measure, right? and then we attribute value to those things. It's almost the other way around. It's like, well, I can measure whether or not the child remembers the times table. Is it useful? I don't know, but I can measure it, right? And what's more, I can see progress. They couldn't, now they can, right? And then we attribute some sort of value that if you do that, then that's great. And what that tends to be is about maximizing efficiency. What we tend to measure and the things that we're teaching are to enable one to get something done with as little effort as possible, in some sense. And then we create an infrastructure that actually maximizes that efficiency, which is competition, which is a great idea in nature, actually. Nature creates competition in order to maximize efficiency, but it's a really bad idea if you want to create creativity. So when thinking about that new narrative and that new environment that you have to create, it's not about the measurement of the things that we can measure for the sake of it. It's about enabling young people, I think, and ultimately all of us, in order to be able to be resilient and thrive and adapt to what's uncertain. And that's what nature does. This is why nature is the way nature is, right? But we've reduced it to a line and all that. We try to maximize efficiency. And that's why we're on that line as opposed to a circle, or rather a spiral is my preferred. And what are the ways of being that enables one to do so? Which you might refer to the narrative. To me, it's the way of being, or what's that ecology that enables one to, for instance, just say, I don't know, and be excited about the fact that I don't know, right? Where we don't celebrate that. We celebrate answers and knowing, etc. So I love the fact that the book is actually creating that space and exploring those ideas that enable people to step away from our past narratives to a new one, which is actually an ancient one. It's actually part and parcel. That's the whole irony, is that, when people, I give a talk and people say, that's great. And I said, the only reason why you think it's great is because you already know it. I said, I haven't told you anything you don't already know, because you're actually living it, right? It's just, I've just described the obvious, right? Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate
thank you for
what you created and the context and the reasons for your creation. And it was a privilege and an honor to have a chat with you.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Well, thanks again.